On the evening of May 25, 1951, two British diplomats boarded a ferry from Southampton to Saint-Malo. They told colleagues they were taking a weekend holiday in France. They never returned. Within days, MI5 discovered that Donald Maclean had just transmitted the West's atomic secrets to Moscow. Guy Burgess had burned his MI6 contacts list, and somewhere in London, 3 more Soviet agents, still undetected, continued their work inside the highest levels of British intelligence. For nearly 2 decades, 5 men from Britain's most elite university had systematically dismantled Western security from within. They attended the same clubs as MI6 directors. They dined with CIA liaisons. They stood beside the Queen herself. And every night, they reported to Moscow. This is the story of the Cambridge Five, the most devastating intelligence breach in British history. A betrayal so complete that some files remain classified to this day, 70 years later. So damaging that when the truth finally emerged, it nearly destroyed the special relationship between Britain and the United States. How did 5 privileged graduates from Cambridge University become Moscow's most valuable assets? And what secrets are still locked away in the archives? Cambridge University, 1930s. While most students debated philosophy over tea, a small group was planning something far more dangerous. The Great Depression had shattered faith in capitalism. Fascism was rising across Europe, and to many young intellectuals, Soviet communism appeared to be the only viable alternative. This was the breeding ground for treason. The Soviet Intelligence Service, then known as the NKVD, recognized an extraordinary opportunity. Cambridge wasn't just any university, it was the pipeline to Britain's elite institutions. The Foreign Office, MI5, MI6, the Treasury. Nearly every position of power in the British establishment was filled by Cambridge graduates. So the Soviets sent their talent spotters. They looked for brilliant young men, idealistic, disillusioned with Western democracy, and sympathetic to Marxist ideology. Men who came from privileged backgrounds but harbored progressive ideals. Men who would have access to state secrets for decades to come. They found 5 perfect candidates. Kim Philby was the golden boy, charming, ambitious, the son of a famous explorer and Arabist. He spoke multiple languages, drank with the right people, and had the social graces to move effortlessly through Britain's corridors of power. Guy Burgess was the chaotic genius, brilliant but reckless, homosexual at a time when it was illegal, connected to everyone who mattered in London's political and cultural circles. Donald Maclean was the diplomat's diplomat, polished, reserved, with impeccable credentials. He would eventually gain access to some of the most sensitive atomic secrets shared between Britain and the United States. Anthony Blunt was the aesthete, an art historian who would become the surveyor of the Queen's pictures, literally working inside Buckingham Palace while sending intelligence to Moscow. And John Cairncross was the quiet intellectual, perhaps the least known, but arguably the most damaging. He would later work at Bletchley Park, the top-secret facility where Britain cracked the German Enigma code during World War II. Between 1934 and 1935, all 5 were recruited by Soviet intelligence. They were given code names, they were taught tradecraft, and they were instructed to do something that would make them far more valuable than ordinary spies. They were told to infiltrate British intelligence itself. The operation was brilliant in its simplicity. Rather than recruiting agents who would immediately start stealing secrets, the Soviets played the long game. The Cambridge Five were told to establish themselves in their careers, to build reputations as loyal British patriots, to rise through the ranks naturally, and it worked beyond Moscow's wildest expectations. Kim Philby joined MI6 in 1940 during World War II. Within just a few years, he was running counterintelligence operations against the Soviet Union. The irony was staggering. Britain's chief spy catcher was himself a Soviet agent. Every morning, Philby would review classified files about Soviet espionage. Every evening, he would photograph the most sensitive documents and pass them to his KGB handler. In newly declassified MI5 files released in January 2025, Philby's own confession reveals the extent of his betrayal. He would take documents home from MI6 headquarters, photograph them overnight, and return them the next morning. His KGB handler would then collect the film. The system was so efficient that Moscow sometimes had British intelligence reports before the Prime Minister did. Donald Maclean's position was even more sensitive. As a diplomat, he was stationed in Washington during the Manhattan Project, the Allied program to develop the atomic bomb. Maclean had access to joint British-American intelligence on atomic energy. In his role, he attended meetings where the locations of uranium deposits were discussed, where bomb designs were shared, where targeting strategies were debated. According to declassified documents, Maclean transmitted at least 5,000 pages of classified material to Moscow between 1944 and 1948. This included critical information about American atomic capabilities, diplomatic cables, and strategic military plans. Soviet scientists later confirmed that intelligence from the Cambridge Ring significantly accelerated their own atomic weapons program. John Cairncross's betrayal was perhaps the most technically significant. Working at Bletchley Park during the war, he had access to decrypted German military communications. He passed thousands of Enigma decrypts to Moscow, including Wehrmacht battle plans on the Eastern Front. Soviet military commanders used this intelligence during the Battle of Kursk in 1943, one of the largest tank battles in history and a turning point in the war. The declassified files reveal something even more disturbing. Cairncross passed information about British code-breaking techniques to the Soviets, potentially compromising Western signals intelligence for decades. Anthony Blunt's role was more complex. He worked in MI5 during the war, then transitioned to his public role as an art historian. But his real value to Moscow was as a talent spotter and handler. He recruited other agents, coordinated operations, and even conducted damage control when the ring was threatened with exposure. Declassified documents from 2025 reveal that after the war, Blunt was sent on a secret mission by the royal family to Germany to retrieve sensitive correspondence that could have embarrassed the monarchy. The Soviets knew about this mission. They had an agent inside the palace. The beginning of the end came from an unexpected source: American codebreakers. In 1943, the U.S. Army's Signal Intelligence Service began a secret program called Venona. The goal was to decrypt Soviet intelligence communications. The work was painstaking, taking years to yield results. But in 1948, the cryptanalysts made a breakthrough. They decrypted a 1944 cable from the Soviet embassy in London that referenced a British diplomat with access to atomic secrets. The diplomat was codenamed Homer. The decrypts didn't reveal his real name, but they contained enough biographical details to narrow down the suspects. MI5 began an investigation. By early 1951, suspicion had focused on Donald Maclean. Investigators noticed his increasingly erratic behavior, heavy drinking, angry outbursts, unexplained absences. They didn't know that Maclean was cracking under the pressure of his double life. But before MI5 could move to arrest him, someone warned Maclean. That someone was Kim Philby. On May 25, 1951, Guy Burgess and Donald Maclean vanished. They boarded a ferry to France, then made their way through Europe, eventually surfacing in Moscow 5 years later. Their defection sent shockwaves through British intelligence. The embarrassment was catastrophic. Here were two senior government officials, both with top-level security clearance, who had fled to the Soviet Union. The Americans were furious. Declassified U.S. diplomatic cables from 1951 show that Washington demanded Britain clean house regardless of whom may be hurt. The CIA began to suspect there was a mole inside MI6 who had warned Maclean. Suspicion inevitably fell on Kim Philby. Philby was interrogated in 1951. He denied everything. His interrogators were not entirely convinced, but they had no hard evidence. More importantly, Philby had powerful protectors. He came from the right background, attended the right schools, knew the right people. The British establishment could not believe that one of their own could be a traitor. In one of the most controversial decisions in intelligence history, Philby was cleared and allowed to remain in MI6. He was quietly reassigned to Beirut as a journalist with continued intelligence connections. Then came the most shocking revelation. In 1963, a Soviet defector named Anatoly Golitsyn provided new information to MI5. He didn't know Philby's name, but his description of a senior MI6 Soviet agent matched Philby perfectly. MI6 sent an officer to confront Philby in Beirut. On January 23, 1963, Kim Philby vanished. Days later, he reappeared in Moscow, where he would live until his death in 1988. But the scandal was far from over. In fact, the most shocking betrayal was still hidden. In 1964, MI5 received information from an American source about a fourth man in the Cambridge ring. The evidence pointed to someone still working in Britain, someone with continued access to sensitive information. That someone was Anthony Blunt. When investigators confronted Blunt, he confessed almost immediately. He admitted to being recruited by the Soviets in the 1930s, to working as a Soviet agent throughout the war, to recruiting other spies, to everything. But here's where the story becomes truly controversial. Instead of being prosecuted, Blunt was offered immunity in exchange for his cooperation. The Attorney General approved the deal. MI5 agreed to keep his confession secret. Blunt would continue his work as the surveyor of the Queen's pictures, as if nothing had happened. According to newly declassified files released in January 2025, there's an even more disturbing detail. Queen Elizabeth II was informed of Blunt's betrayal in 1964. She continued to employ him for another 15 years. He organized royal art exhibitions, advised on palace security, and attended state functions, all while MI5 knew he had spent decades working for the KGB. The files reveal something else. Prime Minister Alec Douglas Home was never informed of Blunt's confession. Neither were most members of the cabinet. The decision to keep Blunt's treachery secret was made by a small group within the intelligence services and approved by the palace. Why? The declassified documents suggest multiple motives. First, MI5 wanted to protect other ongoing investigations. Second, the government feared further damage to the Anglo-American intelligence relationship. Third, and perhaps most significantly, there was concern about what other secrets Blunt might reveal if he went to trial. What secrets? The files remain partially redacted, but they hint at something explosive. During the war, Blunt had access to sensitive royal correspondence. He had been sent to Germany to retrieve documents that could embarrass the monarchy. The fear was that a public trial would expose these missions and raise questions about what the Soviets had learned about the royal family's wartime activities. For 15 years, Blunt's secret held. He lived a double life in reverse, now a reformed spy pretending to be loyal, while MI5 monitored his every move. The truth finally came out in 1979, but not through official channels. A British journalist, Andrew Boyle, published a book about the Cambridge spies that heavily implied Blunt's involvement. The hints were obvious enough that Parliament began asking questions. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher had no choice. On November 15, 1979, she stood in the House of Commons and publicly identified Anthony Blunt as a Soviet spy. The immunity deal was revealed. The cover-up was exposed. The scandal was enormous. How could the government have knowingly employed a Soviet agent in the royal household? How could the Queen have knighted a man she knew to be a traitor? Blunt was stripped of his knighthood, but no charges were ever filed. John Cairncross, the fifth man, was identified around the same time. Unlike the others, he was never prosecuted. He fled to Italy and France, living in obscurity until his death in 1995. In his later years, Cairncross insisted he had never seen himself as a traitor. He claimed he was simply helping Britain's wartime ally, the Soviet Union, and that the information he passed was never used to harm British interests. The declassified files tell a different story. The documents show that Soviet intelligence used information from Cairncross to identify and eliminate British agents operating in Eastern Europe after the war. Part 5. The Deadly Cost, 1430-17 Sac. The Cambridge Five weren't just passing paperwork. Their betrayals had body counts. When Kim Philby was stationed in Washington in the late 1940s, he was the primary liaison between British intelligence and the CIA. In that role, he learned about a joint CIA MI6 operation to infiltrate Albania, then under communist control. The plan was to send Albanian refugees, trained as guerrilla fighters, back into their homeland to incite an uprising against the communist government. Between 1949 and 1951, hundreds of Albanian agents were parachuted into Albania. Nearly all of them were captured and executed. Soviet and Albanian intelligence knew they were coming because Kim Philby had betrayed the entire operation. Declassified CIA documents from the operation estimate that at least 300 men were killed as a direct result of Philby's intelligence leaks. Some were shot on sight, others were captured, tortured for information, and executed. A few were used in show trials to demonstrate the failure of Western intelligence operations. When confronted about Albania years later, Philby showed no remorse. In his autobiography published in Moscow, he described the operation as one episode, which is usually cited to illustrate the human cost of my treachery. But he justified it by arguing that the operation was imperialist aggression against a sovereign communist state. The death toll didn't end there. Throughout the late 1940s and early 1950s, dozens of Western intelligence agents operating behind the Iron Curtain were systematically rolled up by Soviet counterintelligence. MI6 couldn't understand how the Soviets always seemed to be one step ahead. Now we know. The Cambridge Five had compromised virtually every major British intelligence operation against the Soviet Union. The Mitrokhin Archive, a vast collection of KGB files smuggled out of Russia in 1992 by defector Vasily Mitrokhin, confirmed the extent of the damage. The archive revealed that the Cambridge Ring was considered the most successful espionage operation in Soviet history. KGB documents described the intelligence they provided as beyond price. But here's something that remains classified. Mitrokhin's original handwritten notes are still locked away. The British government has released typed summaries of some files, but the complete archive remains restricted. What's in those original notes that's still too sensitive to reveal 70 years after the Cambridge Five's recruitment? Historians have speculated. Some believe the files contain information about additional Soviet agents who were never identified. Others think they may reveal the extent to which the Soviets penetrated other British institutions, the BBC, major newspapers, Parliament itself. There's also the question of American casualties. Philby had access to CIA operations worldwide. How many American agents were exposed because of his betrayal? The full accounting has never been made public. After the Cambridge Five were exposed, the question everyone asked was simple. Why? These were not desperate men selling secrets for money. They came from privilege. They attended elite schools. They had successful careers ahead of them. What motivated 5 Cambridge graduates to commit treason? The answer is unsettling. They believed they were on the right side of history. In interviews given from Moscow, both Philby and McLean remained convinced they had made the correct choice. They had been recruited in the 1930s when Soviet communism seemed like the only ideology capable of standing against fascism. By the time they realized the truth about Stalin's purges, the gulags, and Soviet brutality, they were already trapped. Walking away would mean exposure, prosecution, and prison. But there was something else, something the declassified files reveal. All 5 men were addicted to the thrill of deception. Philby, in particular, described the rush of leading a double life, of knowing he was smarter than his MI6 colleagues, of playing the most dangerous game in the world. In his final confession to MI5, portions of which were declassified in 2025, Philby admitted something chilling. He said that even if he could go back and make a different choice, he wouldn't. The cause, he claimed, was worth any price. But what cause? By the time Philby defected in 1963, the Soviet Union was led by Nikita Khrushchev, who had publicly denounced Stalin's crimes. The idealistic vision of communism that had attracted the Cambridge Five in the 1930s was revealed to be a murderous lie. The files include one more revelation. In 1988, shortly before his death, Kim Philby gave a final interview to a Soviet journalist. He was asked if he regretted anything. His answer was telling. He said he regretted the lives lost in Albania, but he claimed responsibility for those deaths belonged to the Western governments who conceived the operation, not to him for exposing it. To the end, Philby believed he was the hero of his own story. Today, many documents related to the Cambridge Five remain classified. The full extent of what they betrayed may never be known. But their legacy is undeniable. They represent the most damaging intelligence failure in British history, a scandal that exposed the vulnerabilities of blind trust in social class and educational pedigree. And somewhere in the restricted sections of MI5 archives and the classified portions of the Mitrokhin files, there are still secrets waiting to be revealed. Questions that remain unanswered, names that have never been spoken. The story of the Cambridge Five may not be over yet.